Hi, my name is Chris Perry, and I'm the Director of Music Therapy for the Community Music Center of Boston. Welcome to our community conversation. This was our first community conversation using the Zoom platform, doing it online, and the first couple slides of the presentation were cut off. So I'm going to recreate them quickly for you and then cut into the actual presentation. So we're going to pull up our presentation. All right. So, welcome to the community conversations at the Community Music Center of Boston. Today we're going to be talking about creating inclusive spaces. So, we're going to start by going over the guidelines and expectations. In the bottom right-hand corner, you see our agenda for the day. First, we're going to talk about these expectations. Then we are going to redefine what disability is. We're going to define what inclusive spaces are. Then we're going to talk about how to create an inclusive space. Then we're going to examine our own spaces. So first, talking about the guidelines for the discussion. So these were guidelines that were taken from a previous community conversation on the equity of power in arts education, led by Executive Director Lacolian Washington. So these are his guidelines, and I wanted to use them to create shared guidelines across community conversations. So we are going to first accept each speaker's viewpoint as true for them. Secondly, we're going to have no assumptions except good intentions. Don't blame or assume blame. We're going to focus on our own learning today. Everybody's in a different place with this. We're going to embrace the likelihood of a lack of closure. There's going to be a lot of questions about inclusion that are going to exist even after this. One microphone, one voice, and don't yuck my yum. So when somebody's expressing a preference about something, make sure to not make a negative comment about it and yuck it. Next, here are the expectations. So, if at any time you hear me say information that you disagree with, please speak up. Just because I'm the person who has the microphone right now does not mean that I am the expert in all inclusive spaces. Now, I believe that as a full community, when we put our voices together, we are going to be able to have more accurate and full information. So feel free to leave and take a break at any time. At the conclusion of each section, there will be time for discussion. And in the next slide, we'll speak about what discussion looks like. In the final section of the workshop, participants will be given the option to join an additional breakout group. And then at the end of this event, the recording and the slides will be made available. So, to participate in the conversation today, we are going to, you can click on the chat button, which is in the bottom of the screen. And through the chat, you can either send a message to everyone or you can send a message privately to somebody else. And to let me know that you have a comment, you can also click on the participants button and choose the raise hand feature. And Sarah Spinella, who's our director, our chief of advancement, she is going to be monitoring that. So this presentation will primarily focus on inclusion through a disability lens. Other marginalized groups will be mentioned but not addressed with equal time. This decision is not meant to devalue other groups of people. As a white cisgender able-bodied man, I'm included in most spaces. And this privilege means that I have many blind spots. So feel free to let me know if you see one. You can let me know in the chat or you can let me know after. One blind spot that I definitely have had is the fact that we are actually hosting this event on Passover. So that was a blind spot that I had when I scheduled this event a couple months ago. And I'm really, so please let me know if if you see another blind spot that I have. So we're going to get into things and talk about redefining disability. So I want you to think in your head about what you see when you see somebody with a disability. Classically, it may be the image with a blue background of a wheelchair user. But today we're going to talk a little bit about the other ways that disability could look. So 61 million adults in the United States live with a disability. This is something, this is from the CDC. So that's 26% of adults in the United States have some type of disability. So looking at what those disabilities might look like, the highest percentage of adults with a disability have a mobility disability. So that may be serious difficulty walking or climbing stairs. Then over 10% of the U.S. adult population may have a disability, a cognitive disability, which could be serious difficulty concentrating, remembering, or making decisions. So we can see from that not every disability is visible, right? Certainly 26% of the population are not wheelchair users or do not use another alternate device to walk or to be mobile. So that means that many people have invisible disabilities. And in the graphic on the right, some of those are listed. Right? It could be anxiety, could be depression. Some of the things that aren't listed on the slide on the right could be something like an autoimmune disease or something like that. Many disabilities, in fact, most disabilities are not visible. So we're going to talk a little bit about the evolution of disability models. So this is how society and how people view individuals with disabilities. We're going to start with a model that I think is the most outdated, and we'll move to one that is more current. So the first model is the charity model. So in this model, people with disabilities are pitied. They need the help of non-disabled individuals to contribute to society. So this is when you hear phrases like, this person suffers from something like autism. Using language like that makes it seem incredibly negative, and that people are to be pitied. The next model, which is still an extremely common model, is the medical model, which is this idea that people with disabilities are sick and they need to be cured. They can function the same way as non-disabled individuals with treatment. So in here, there's definitely some discrimination and some bias, right? There's this idea that an individual with a disability is less than a non-disabled individual. And the best thing that you can do for them is help them be just like a non-disabled individual. So now we're going to move to the social model, which is the most progressive and the one that we're going to live in during this presentation. And it can be a tough concept initially. So we'll talk about it a little bit in the discussion after this. But in the social model, disability is a concept that's imposed by society. Societal and environmental structures disable individuals. Once those are removed, individuals can experience life equally. So what does that look like? What does some of those social and environmental structures look like? So here's one. A blind person is not unable to use the restroom, but they may be unable to use the restroom at a business due to lack of signage. So there is an environmental structure that is a barrier and that is disabling them. A student with a learning disability is not unable to learn, but they may be unable to learn with a particular teacher if the teacher has rigid teaching practices. If there's one specific way the teacher wants to teach a lesson, that may be a structure that is disabling the student. And our last one, a person with autism is not unable to enjoy live music, but they may be unable to have a positive experience at a concert venue due to the design and the expectations of other patrons. So that's both a social structure, the expectations of how you quote unquote behave at a concert, and then the environmental structures, maybe the incredibly high ceiling or the building that is built to be very loud may be a structure that that disables them from having a positive experience. So it's best to use a label-free approach. So instead of trying to diagnose a person, try to see the barriers around them that are disabling them. This is a really important one, and a really important one in just in community work in general. People do not walk around with a tag on their chest that says what their diagnosis may be. So it's really important to try to look past that and think past that and look towards the barriers in a space that may be disabling them. So this is one of my favorite quotes about disability. It's by a professor named Dr. Stephen Shore, and he says, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Just because you know somebody has autism doesn't mean you know the most effective way to communicate with them. It doesn't mean that you know all of the barriers that exist for them in their life. It just means you've met one person with autism. So now we're going to take our first discussion break. So I'm going to try to look in the chat feature for myself. And I may actually, I don't have to stop the screen share. So I'm going to check in the chat feature and try to check the raise your hand feature to see if anybody has a question. So now would be a time that you could throw in a question, throw in a statement. So I'm looking back. Lacolian is a statement saying he loves the framing on social and environmental structures. Now I'm going to see if I can check our participants list to see if anybody has a question or a statement. Nobody has their hand raised, which means either I'm doing great explaining things, or nobody knows how to use the raise your hand feature. We'll figure it out as we move forward in this presentation. So feel free to use either the chat feature or the raise your hand. So there was one chat. So Lacolian did add a question which says, how can we reframe our lenses to see what you're talking about? So hopefully we are going to get to that a little bit further in this presentation when we define an inclusive space. So Lacolian, what I'm going to do is I'm going to loop back to that a little bit later to see if I've done a good enough job contextualizing that for you. So in this next part, we are going to define inclusive spaces. So inclusive spaces are adaptable. There are always multiple ways to experience them. Information is presented with different access points. So I've tried to do my best to make this presentation as inclusive as possible. So the things I did to make there be multiple ways to experience them was sharing out the slides beforehand. I'm also making sure that all of the relevant material is written down on the slides. So for folks who might have a little bit of a difficulty with listening comprehension, that there's always going to be written words that explain things. And then in the corner, I even have something for our folks who are visual. I try to have as many visual things as possible. So the next thing inclusive spaces are collaborative. So in an inclusive space, many voices are listened to, represented, and amplified. The power structure is not top down. And I love this quote from that I saw from an article in the Harvard Business Review, which is, diversity is useless without inclusivity, right? If we just have people in the room, but we're not listening to them, we're not amplifying their voices, then we're not really doing the work. So in terms of collaboration, I've tried to clearly define the fact that I'm not the only expert on this, and that I have a lot of blind spots. And hopefully there's going to be more places later in the presentation for more voices other than my own to be heard. So the next thing, inclusive spaces are transparent. So shared agreements and expectations make sure that everybody understands the values and can be successful. So at the beginning, we talked about our discussion guidelines and our expectations to make sure that we're all on the same page about the best ways that we could participate in this presentation. One thing to remember is that inclusion always involves multiple perspectives. So first step to inclusion is amplifying the voices of the current stakeholders. And you could think about the current stakeholders of whoever's in your space. We're going to talk a little bit later about defining what our spaces are. But next, when you're thinking about inclusion, you need to think about what perspectives are missing from your space, whose voices are not being heard, and why are their perspectives missing. So next we're going to talk a little bit about some of the perspectives that might be missing. This is a slide that was shared to me by our executive director, LaColine Washington, which is a great way to think about the privileged and marginalized groups that exist. So he calls it the matrix of American perspective. So if you see down the left side of this graph, there are different social identity categories like race, gender, sex, sexual orientation, etc. And who we're going to be talking about is folks who most often exist in marginalized groups. Those are the voices that usually need to be represented or amplified more in spaces. So we'll just go down. So marginalized groups in the United States are Black, Asian, and Latinx folks, are individuals who are transgender or genderqueer, women, gay men, lesbians, individuals who are working class or poor, older individuals, and individuals who are Jewish, Muslim, or Hindu, and people with disabilities. So partial inclusion is really but true inclusion is exceptional. So just modifying a physical space are not going to fix all of the accessibility issues. And it's not going to make an inclusive space for everyone. Frequently, individuals with disabilities or other marginalized groups are able to enter a space, but they still don't have the same opportunities as those from privileged social groups. So the existing structures, systems, policies, and norms can all exclude marginalized groups. So the next slide is about the importance of inclusion. I always sometimes balk at selling the importance of inclusion, because it seems like an obvious value, but I think it's important to understand also what it brings to spaces. So these specific facts are specifically about making organizations more inclusive. So a 2017 McKinsey study found that leadership teams with gender diversity or ethnic diversity were more likely to experience above average profitability. In the same study, organizations with inclusive cultures are 6 times more likely to be innovative than their peers. And according to the Harvard Business Review, employees who feel included are 42% less likely to leave their job within a year. So we're gonna have time for another discussion break, and I'm gonna look up at the chat, and see if I can see. It looks like there've been nothing new added to the chat. I'm gonna see if anybody has their hand raised. I don't see any raised hands, but feel free to do that in this next section. So next we're going to talk about creating inclusive spaces. And Colleen, hopefully this is where we're going to try to put on that lens a little bit more. So in this, I hope you weren't coming to this presentation trying to find a specific hack, because the real message that I want to tell you is the most important thing to create an inclusive space is you. Things to change physical space be incredibly expensive. Adapting a whole entire curriculum, incredibly worth it. That can be incredibly challenging for a small organization, for a nonprofit. The one thing that you can always bring with you to create an inclusive space is you. So one way to do that is to always show equal respect for all individuals and their needs. Part of showing respect is asking folks about what their needs are. You may not be able to see that. The next thing is being humble. That's incredibly important in creating an inclusive space. Almost everybody that's going to say a need or ask for a space to be more inclusive, they are doing it because they think something about your space is wrong, right? So instead of being defensive, being humble is incredibly important, and be flexible. Being as accommodating as possible is a great way to show folks respect. So the next thing is to try to remove some of those structures and systems of exclusion. So first, you have to identify them, but they are not always they're not always easy to see. So if you can't see them, find someone who can see them. Invite people from other marginalized groups or people who you don't see in your space and ask them, why are you not in my space? And try to advocate for them. And always make sure that you're not just removing a structure, but replacing it with something more inclusive. So another thing you can do is to use inclusive language. Language really demonstrates respect. When you're talking about somebody, when especially you're talking about someone's disability, it's really important to use the correct language. And the best thing that you can do is ask, even though that can feel perhaps a little embarrassing. It really does show somebody respect, show somebody that you care if you're asking the way that they want to be described to somebody else. So the other thing we've already mentioned a little bit, creating those shared agreements. So collaborating with community members on the group norms and making sure that the values of your space are known. There are a lot of different ways that you can make the values of your space known. It can be in the languages that you are presenting something in, which to say, I mean, certainly a blind spot. This presentation is only available in English. Another way that you can demonstrate those values is by having pictures, or having by showing people in your space, right? So this is one of my favorite sayings, and it's from the disability rights movement. So the saying is, nothing about us without us. And this was a saying that I believe came up a little bit when the ADA was coming to pass in 1990, but also was used frequently afterwards. And so the idea around this phrase is making sure that the people who are affected by structures or policies have a voice in the creation of them, right? Don't make a policy about somebody without consulting them, right? Without seeing what the impact might be. So that brings us back to that idea of collaboration. That's really key in an inclusive space. So in the spirit of nothing about us without us, you've heard all from me, and so I want to give you some other voices. So this video is specifically about being inclusive in the classroom. So it is definitely going to have that lens on. And the title of the video, I think it's called Dear Teacher. And the idea is that students are telling a teacher what they need in a classroom. The students are advocating for themselves about their learning style. So we're gonna, I believe that I'm going to be able to share this audio with you. But what I'm going to ask is, Sarah, if you are unable to hear the audio of this video, if you could just speak up and let me know. I have added subtitles to this video, so we can watch it without, but I think there are a couple of ways that I can make it happen. So I'm going to play this video, and hopefully you can hear it.
Dear teacher, I know it doesn't always seem like it, but I really do want to listen and learn.
It's just my brain is kind of different. So this is what I'd like you to know about me. I have to move, or I really can't pay attention.
Even though I'm not looking at you, I can still listen to what you're saying.
If you tell me, sit up straight, now I have to use all of my brain to do just that.
It makes me feel sad when you tell me to try harder, even though I've already tried as hard as I can.
I actually listen better when I'm rocking in my chair. When you give me a bunch of directions, I start to think I will never remember all of this. Sometimes my mom or dad ends up doing all of my homework. So here's how you could maybe help. Let me get up and move while I'm learning.
Let me look wherever I want when you talk to me.
Let me rock or slouch in my chair.
No matter what, please don't take away my recess. Give me help I could do all by myself. Make directions very short.
Just ask me, what does your brain need right now?
And one more thing. My brain might be different than yours, but it's still amazing.
Sincerely, your student.
Your student.
Your student. Your student.
Exit full screen here. Okay. So I really like that video just because it has students who are advocating for themselves. And I think it's funny just asking somebody what they need to participate more in a space isn't a question that is asked that often. So we are going to go to the next discussion break. And I see some comments that they love it, and it makes a couple of folks who work with students miss them a lot. I agree as well. Michael shared that he used to make that mistake in his first few years of teaching, as though his students' eyes always had to be on him. So I appreciate you sharing those comments. So we are about to move to a portion of the presentation that is a little bit more interactive, and I am excited. So for this next part of the presentation, you are going to re-examine a space in your life. And so I'm going to walk you through how we're going to do that. This is going to be an activity that you can either choose to do on your own, or we are going to set up some breakout groups. I believe that Sarah, as the host, is going to be able to set up a couple of breakout groups. So the first thing that I want you to do is think about a space that you want to make more inclusive. So it could be a classroom if you're a teacher. It could be a meeting room. It could be your office space. It could be a workplace. It could be a performance venue, or your favorite coffee shop or restaurant. So I'm going to give you a couple of extra seconds to think about which space you would like to work on today. All right. So the next thing that we are going to do is consult your guide. So there was something that was emailed to you before this presentation. Is also available in the chat. I'm also going to see, I think I can throw it in the chat again right now. So I'm going to put a link to a handout. It's also going to be available on the screen, and we're going to talk through it right now. But once you go to the breakout groups, I don't believe my screen sharing feature is going to continue to work. So you can go to this website to see the handout. So what we're going to do on this handout, there's a lot of words on it and a lot of things. We're just going to answer one question in the top half and consider the experience of one person in the bottom half. So in this part one, when examining your space, consider the following questions. And so today for the exercise, we're just going to choose one. But if this is something you want to do in the future, it's great to think about all of these. So these are some questions that were asked before. So who is not represented in your space? Who in your space does not have an equal voice? And can everyone enter the space with dignity and move freely without assistance from another person. So you can just spend 30 seconds or a minute just thinking about that a little bit, trying to answer one of those questions about your space in your head. And then we'll have some breakout groups to chat about it. Here, Vanessa, is where we need our hold music back. All right, so you can have some more time later to do this solo or in your breakout group, but we're going to move on to the next portion, which is I'd like you to consider the possible experience and representation of the following groups. So today, we're just going to choose one, but I've listed a number of different folks who are part of marginalized groups. So the question that I want you to think about is, I'm using this word user experience, but would their user experience be significantly different than others? So would their experience in your space be different? And what is something that they would not have access to? So some of the possible experiences that you could consider today is the experience of a person who's blind, a person who experiences anxiety, an autistic person, a wheelchair user, a person with ADHD, or a person who's experienced trauma. Individuals who belong to other marginalized groups could include a person whose primary language is not English, a person of color, a person who's transgender or non-binary, a woman, a person who practices a marginalized religion. In the U.S., it's primarily non-Christian religions, and a person from the LGBTQ plus community, or a person who's experiencing poverty. So I'm going to give you another 30 seconds or a minute to think a little bit about that experience. So we'll have some more time to think and talk about it. Next, what we're going to do is if you're interested, we're gonna share with your breakout groups. So for a lot of folks, verbally processing information is a lot easier than just thinking about it in their head. So I want to provide people with multiple opportunities. That being said, many people who are introverts might prefer to work on their own. So what I would like you to do is, if you would prefer not to be in a breakout group, if you could you can either use the raise your hand feature, or you can either send a message to the chat. You can also, if you'd prefer, send that message privately. Sarah is also telling me that although you will be assigned to a breakout group, you can choose whether or not to go in it. So it looks like we are going to assign everyone to groups, but you do not have to join that breakout session. So the two things that I want you to think about are identify barriers and create solutions. So we've talked a lot about barriers, and we've talked a little bit less about solutions. And part of the reason is because instead of having a checklist for inclusion, it really is more of a mindset. So try to use your inclusion mindset to create some solutions. So I'm going to stop the sharing, and if you have something to say, you can either throw it in the chat or you can use the raise your hand feature. I'm going to try to keep monitoring both of those things. All right. So we're back into non-group sharing. So I just want to read. I'll read something Melaine wrote. So as the mother of a child with special needs, the most important thing one can do, also as an educator, is to make the child or student feel as normal as possible, encouraging their self-esteem no matter what. I absolutely love that. Acceptance is such an important part of inclusion. So, does anyone have anything from their breakout group that they feel like they would like to share? It could be something about your space, could be something that just popped into your head, or something that somebody else said that really made an impact on you. All right. Looks like Vanessa has something. So, and Vanessa, you've already unmuted yourself. Amazing. Thank you for sharing.
Samantha brought up an excellent point about, being online teaching, and how this is affecting all of us. And some of it is a privilege because there's a percentage of my students that don't have the internet, even though BPS is working towards that and getting them a hotspot. But I want to say that I did have a Zoom class with my kindergartners at the Murphy School. And at that school, I do have a multiple handicapped component to it. And I had a student in his wheelchair who's basically paraplegic, and he was on camera, and it was one of the biggest joys. And when people saw him who knew him, they were like, "Lou, you're on." And so it was definitely a rose amongst the thorns that we're dealing with right now.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that story. Does anybody else have anything from their breakout group that popped into their head that they wanted to share? Looks like I saw Ian somewhere. Looks like Samantha, and then after Samantha, Lacolian.
I just wanted to continue Vanessa's sentiment from our breakout group that this talk in particular has sort of inspired me to look more into how those folks with disabilities are experiencing the COVID-19 quarantine crisis. It's, we are so wrapped up in our own worlds and our own bubbles and our own selves right now for so many different reasons, and it needs to be that way for a lot of people. But as an educator, being reminded of the bigger perspective makes me really want to look into how our folks that identify as disabled experiencing this time, and what outlets are there for them, what resources are there for them that I don't even know about, outside of that community. So I want to, take these steps to learn about the resources that are out there for folks in the disabled community during this time.
Samantha, I really appreciate you sharing that, and I just want to mention one thing before we bounce to the Lacolian, which is that I think another aspect of the current health crisis is that a lot of people are probably going to be experiencing temporary disabilities, whether it's an invisible disability like a mental health need. This is a time where a lot of folks are experiencing something that they haven't experienced previously, but also there may be some temporary physical disabilities that end up coming out of this time, temporary or permanent. So it is an interesting time to be thinking about disability and inclusion. And so we'll go to Lacolian and then Diego.
I actually when I was in my group, I didn't say anything. I just kind of listened because I joined a little bit late. But one of the great things about what I heard was, that the folks in that room were talking about all of the they acknowledged the fact that there were some nice things that were happening, but they were also saying, well, these are all the areas in which we have to get better. And it was really a lot of spaces, they will pat themselves in the back if they've checked 3 of the 900 boxes, because then at least they made an effort. And if they got to 10, they would really pat themselves on the back. And if they got to 100, they would, send out a press release. And it was nice to be in a group where, even though we might be doing a lot of things in the right way and our hearts are in the right place, there's also recognition that there's a difference between your stated values and your practiced values. And I really appreciated that there was a group of people who were thinking about that. They were like, yes, we do say these things, and these are the ways in which we exhibit that. But there are also so many ways in which we're not exhibiting that. And so these are the spaces in which we have to get better. I was really just kind of taken by that in a conversation that I wasn't totally in, that I really observed from the periphery, but it was really cool to hear it.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Licolian. And Diego, you had your hand raised as well.
Hi, yeah, thank you. You sort of spoke to this a little bit where you were saying, kind of one of the consequences of like of what's going on right now with the pandemic is that people may be experiencing temporary disabilities. I wonder if maybe you could say a little bit about people with temporary disabilities. Oftentimes when I hear about like how we should engage people with disabilities, we talk about people who have kind of long-term disabilities, people who are physically disabled or mentally, or, is someone who's temporarily disabled, I mean, I don't want to take away from like someone who is more permanently disabled. Should we think of them differently, or is that a group that we should consider to be like fully disabled even in their temporary status?
Yeah, I really appreciate that thought. And I think, one thing we didn't talk about as much, which I believe to be true, is that, disability is a little bit of a spectrum. I know if I'm lucky to live another 50, another 60 years, I probably will have a disability. Many individuals at their end of their life end up having a disability. And it is something that is a little bit more fluid than it is often talked about. So I really appreciate you thinking about that. And I think that's one of the reasons that inclusive spaces and inclusive mindset is so important. Just because you are not necessarily working with, or because your space doesn't have a particular individual with a disability currently, that does not mean that somebody who's already in your space could experience a temporary disability. So yeah, I think in terms of that they don't need to be treated differently, and that everybody should be just looked at from a needs lens, right? What does this person need to feel more included? What does this person need to be more successful? I think in some ways we've talked about that even as it relates to personality types, right? How can this, what is somebody who may have this personality type need in this situation? Does that answer your question at all, Diego?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted a little more insight, and I appreciate that.
Absolutely. I appreciate the thought. I'm looking through and I don't see any other hand raised. But I do see that Hannah put a side note plug. I know that she is working. She's working in a group to create a website called diversemusiclearners.com. And they are having an upcoming launch. It's going to be a really awesome resource that I'm really excited about, that we should definitely share internally and externally as we think about trying to make our practices more inclusive. Great. So let's see. I'm going to jump back to screen sharing. to get us through the last couple of slides. We are towards the end of our presentation. So I really appreciate that group sharing. You know, it can be sometimes a tough and a humbling thing to think about, and kind of putting on a different perspective, putting on a different hat, thinking about a situation with a different kind of empathy can be difficult. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. So now go include. You know, I hope that you feel empowered to create solutions. Many disability laws are not enforced until someone speaks up. There's not a person going around or an organization going around. There's not an inclusion police officer that's going around. You know, in many ways, communities have to police themselves. So be that person. When you see somebody being excluded, be the person to include them. Oh, it looks like there is another thing in the chat that I'm gonna. It looks like Maria's gonna jump out, but I will maybe follow up with her afterwards. So we've already. I think we've probably finished our final discussion, but if anybody has anything else that they want to share, they can do it right now in the chat window or by raising their hands. It looks like Vanessa does have her hand up, so I'm going to stop my screen share, and we can go to Vanessa.
Yeah. In my at my one school, I have lab classes. And there's a plethora of different, the differentiation is amazing in the class. And what I'm finding is a lot of times when we are doing the creative process, it's sabotaged by the paraprofessional because they might not want the students getting up and moving around and being a little more creative. They kind of, you know, because what's in their classroom is a lot different than from what is in my classroom. And that happens more than I like it to happen. I try to nip it in the bud before it happens, but I'm not always successful in that. And I was just wondering if you have any insights on how to go about that in an easier way, or to not let it happen at all.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because the honest truth is that, you know, oftentimes when we're trying to create an inclusive space, we're not the only one that has a say right there, right? There's a shared power structure wherever we are, and so I think in situations like that, ideally, you can try to create some shared agreements. So letting and this is probably something you have done previously, or might be, but letting folks know beforehand that letting a paraprofessional know that I'm going to be working in the student with this particular way, and I have this particular expectation, and this is why I'm going to be doing that. And I understand that it might not always be something that this individual does, but trying to create a shared understanding of why can be really important, because oftentimes there can be some miscommunication, or in some ways, I know in some ways that's happened to me, and I've had to be humble because oftentimes the para knows something that I didn't know, right? So right. I'm trying to jump up and get this kid to dance, and it turns out that 5 minutes before I walked in the room, there was a dance fiasco, and I don't know about that. So it's also important for me in those situations to also maybe ask them why, you know, and not in a way that's confrontational, but trying to understand a little bit from their perspective. Thanks so much.
And I have another question too.
Yeah.
And in another class that I have at the Harvard Kent, I started them in January, and it's the fifth grade lab class, and it's hellacious, and I might have 4 out of the 10 in class by the end of the class, because their transition is all messed up coming to my classroom. And then I hear a lot of F bombs about me, about the school, and this, that, and the other thing. And I leave on Tuesdays feeling like a failed teacher sometimes, and it's quiet on the ride home. There's no music playing, it's quiet. And I'm just looking for, I don't know, maybe something hopeful about how to get all those kids involved, when I can't even, when they come in and just a crazy time. And our school also has, a lot of times the kids aren't allowed off the floor. So, but they don't want me to go up to the classroom, and it's a mishmash of a lot of things that I don't feel happy about when I leave on Tuesdays.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that. That sounds like a really difficult situation. And I mean, I would first say that, as much as you're able, it's important to know that, that everybody has limits. Everybody is doing their best, and that there's often many outside factors that are set up to not make you succeed. So it's certainly not your fault if you are not reaching kids for 100% of the time. I went to a presentation a couple months ago by somebody, I believe his name is Dr. Ross Green, and I can share his information afterwards, but he has a philosophy that's called inclusion through collaboration. And it's all about specifically working with individuals with behavioral needs, trying to make the process more collaborative, especially when a large behavioral need comes up, like somebody throwing out an F-bomb. Instead of immediately trying to correct the behavior, perhaps ask a follow-up question about the student's feelings, trying to understand, trying to ask the student to collaborate on a solution. So I'll share some of his I'll share his information with you that I personally found really interesting, and it's especially about working with students with behavioral needs. Michael's making a great comment about relationship and trust building. And that idea that instead of making corrective actions, you are trying to make collaborative solutions, and that's going to go a long way towards things. And that's all to say that it is incredibly challenging work to do. So I really appreciate you sharing. Let's see, are there any other comments before we move to the end? All right, so I'm gonna jump into screen sharing mode again. So I really appreciate all participating. If you liked this presentation and you'd like to support CMCB with a donation, you can text CMCB to 243-25. And I would love to follow up with you. My email address is in the corner, but I'm also able to also hang out on this call for as long as you want if anybody wants to chat. Since we do have a couple of events coming up. Our June event is definitely happening online, and our May event, we're trying to figure out ways to have it online. It's possible that we may do something a little bit different, just because we're finding that not everything translates. But definitely keep in touch with us about future community conversations. We're looking forward to this continuing to grow. And that is the end of the presentation. So thank you again so much for being a part of this.